And welcome everyone to this latest edition of the Fireside Chat here that we do with the AI Guild. My name is Evan Simpson and I'll be your host today. And I'm very, very excited to announce that I have an incredibly special guest with us and a recent member of the AI Guild, Dr. Sowmya Vajjala. And she's going to be speaking with us today, continuing our discussion about coded bias and about just the general concept of bias in natural language process, not only in deep learning, but also in all aspects of machine learning, with this particular emphasis most likely in natural language processing. And before I pass it over to Dr. Vajjala, I would like to just briefly once again introduce myself. As I said before, my name is Evan Simpson and I'm a member of the AI Guild. I'm currently based in Tirana, Albania, but before that I was in Berlin, Germany, where I completed a data science boot camp where I used computer vision and natural language processing to answer the question, how old does someone need to be in order to read a book? And I had a little bit of fun with that and also answered the question, can you judge a book by its cover? Short answer is you can judge a book by its cover, but it's much better if you actually read the book. So that's a little bit about me. And now I'd love to throw it over to our wonderful guest today, Dr. Vajjala.
Hey, thanks, Evan. And yeah, thanks for having me here. Let us see how it goes. Like I said before, I'm also nervous because I didn't do this kind of thing in the past few months. Okay, so I'm Sowmya and I work as a researcher in natural language processing at National Research Council, Canada. And I'm also the co-author of a book called Practical Natural Language Processing, published by O'Reilly Media last year. The book is also translated into Chinese. And we also have a website, practicalnlp.ai. So to know more about us, check out the website and read the book.
And I can personally highly recommend that book of yours, because the book Practical NLP, because I used it as part of the 66 Days of Data challenge. And I cannot begin to tell you just how useful it was. And I also used it as well during one of my internships. So thank you very much for your hard work with that. Now, speaking of which, getting back into it though, talking about the idea of coded bias, we've both watched the movie. We've both read the book, Weapons of Mass Destruction. Can you tell me, what are your general thoughts on this subject? We can start really big and then drill down into a specific topic if you like.
So I more tend to agree with what is being said in coded bias as well as in weapons of mass destruction. But then I don't know if there is a way out of it now. Like from my perspective, I think we crossed the point of no return.
When did we do that? So okay, because like we can put a pin on the conversation of like if there's nothing that can be done. We'll get to that later. But so when do you think we crossed the Rubicon and now the die's been cast? What was that point?
I don't know, probably like a few years back, where we started using more and more of social media and doing everything online. I mean, I don't think there was one point. It was more like a gradual progression probably, but I feel there is no way out of this right now. Like, I mean, we can't go back to like this period where we used to do a lot of non-trackable transactions and non-trackable just communication. I don't know if we can go back to that era. I mean, I agree with everything that is being said. I agree that this is not a good way to have, like, we are being surveilled, nudged, and classified like one of those characters in coded biases, I forgot whom, in a way that we don't see, so that we move along somebody's desired path. So that is what is happening right now, but I don't know what's the solution for that, because I think we can't go back to this time when we are not being tracked.
Okay, so if people are being tracked, okay, so I totally agree with you that the genie's out of the bottle. the toothpaste is out of the tube, you're not getting it back in. So then, okay, now what? So we'll just say, okay, fine. So I will take what you say as true, and I'm with you on this. I'm totally with you. So now what do we do?
I don't know, maybe more regulation.
Okay.
And we need to, like, there should be some way of So I can talk more about it from the perspective of NLP, probably like some way of like better documentation of what exactly are these systems doing. And I don't know, better ways of testing to identify where these systems are showing some kind of bias to certain populations or things like that. And yeah, just more regulation. I mean, if somebody is using an AI system to identify who is a potential criminal, and then like if they identify some normal person as a criminal, what are the consequences? Like, who is going to be penalized for this? I mean, like if a self-driving car kills somebody, who pays the insurance? Like, car can't pay the insurance, right? Like, I mean, these are the kind of things that I think uh, uh, people should discuss more. I mean, I don't have any experience with those kind of regulatory things. I can't comment on that, but I think that is the direction we should go, because we can't go back to, I don't know, 90s.
I completely agree with you that as I said previously, I'm totally in lockstep agreement with you that the genie's out of the bottle. So when you say though that people need to be discussing this, who are those people that should be discussing it, and who do you think can actually inform them so that they can make useful decisions?
I don't know. Policymakers should be. I mean, I think it should be a assorted group of people, like policymakers, also people who are developing AI systems but are willing to accept that these systems are not perfect. And also, like, I mean, sometimes when I follow a lot of AI researchers on Twitter, and there are some people like very experienced, famous people who seem to think that our job is only to develop the systems, not to think about their consequences. So when I say a group of people should join, I'm not talking about this group of people. I'm talking about people who are aware that our job does not end just by developing algorithms, and we need to think, more about potential flaws in it. And yeah.
Isn't that the joke though, that the machine learning team, they create the product and then they just throw it over the wall and they say, your problem now, you engineer it. So if that's the issue with just trying to implement the code, how would we be able to take those people another step back and get them to think about the potential impact of the algorithm of the systems that they're designing?
I don't know. Like there's a lot of discussion these days on ethics of machine learning, ethics of NLP, and that kind of stuff. I think that's one way of doing it, but then bias can come in other ways too. Like, I mean, when people talk about bias, usually they talk about racial bias or sexist bias. There can be bias of different kinds, right? Like in natural language processing, bias can be in the form of language. Like, say, machine translation systems work well with certain languages, but not with others. But then when you or even language generation, like GPT-3 and these kind of things. So when OpenAI released its beta, I tried it with Telugu, my native language. It's a Dravidian language spoken in South India. It was just horrible. I mean, it is just like, it is as good or as bad as how these kind of generation systems were like 15 years ago, just with n-gram models. Or like, say, 5 years ago with RNNs, like recurrent neural networks. I didn't find anything fancy with GPT-3 when I tried to generate Telugu text, and it was, I mean, first it was funny. I was laughing at it, and then I was just holding my head because I couldn't understand what it is. Like, it's just repeating the same thing. First of all, it was a meaningless word, and then it was being repeated 20 times, 30 times. I mean, no such word exists in Thiru, but it kept repeating the same word like 20, 30 times out of the 50 words it generated.
And because I know that when you're using GPT-3 in English, after a certain point, it just starts repeating the same word over and over again.
Okay, maybe it's the same thing, but even before that, the text it generated basically did not make sense. Like the first 5 or 6 words were okay. Like I thought, okay, maybe it's generating something, but afterwards it was like I didn't understand anything.
Fair enough. Okay, yeah, because I was really interested to talk with you about that, because I was wondering just how much bias you actually see when switching between languages. Is
I
there?
think, I mean, I don't know. I don't have a way to quantify it. I'm sure
Yeah.
people are working on it, but there's a lot of difference. Like it depends on what languages you know and what you test on, right? Like if all you know is say English and German, a lot of NLP systems are pretty good. So then you may conclude that, we solve language problem. And it's not just that. Sorry,
Nope.
you continue.
Nope. After you.
No, it's not just like which language works better, right? It's also that. So some time back, I was working in a company that builds software for lawyers. So we used to work with a lot of legal documents. But many of these NLP tools, like say name entity recognition software or things like that, they don't do that well with legal documents. And then say you have PDF and you extract a text from it. So you don't extract properly formed sentences sometimes. And these tools break, they don't do well. So I see all these things as bias. Like for me, bias is just not limited to showing racial bias or sexist bias. Of course, implications are different for racial or sexist bias versus language or genre or those kind of biases. But everything is a bias, is a form of bias.
So then what can we do? Because what we're talking about though, because I'd love to talk to you more about like you were saying about the limitations of languages such as Telugu. And so what can be done in that area to reduce the bias for some of these other languages?
So I think usually the way these NLP systems work, like when, say for Google Translate or something, when they build like these massive translation systems that work on hundreds of language pairs, there's no, I don't know how much tuning they do per language pair. Like it's like a universal model which works on everything. So because of that reason, because of the way it is developed, I don't think it is possible to avoid this bias against some languages versus others. Because I think there may be some specific component, some language specific component that is necessary to avoid that bias, but there's no incentive for that. Like, I mean, who uses Telugu to English translation, let us say, other than for, just like pleasure purposes or, does it have a commercial value? We don't know. So I don't know if these large organizations will have interest in doing that kind of customization. So I don't think that bias will go away. So there's no way to avoid, but there are ways to at least acknowledge it in like two ways, like in my view. Better testing, like, I mean, it's not exactly clear how you do testing of NLP systems in real world the way you do software testing, right? And better documentation. So better testing and better documentation. So better testing may help us identify what language pairs, say in machine translation scenario, are not doing well compared to the ones that are doing extremely well. And better documentation lets us acknowledge that we are not perfect.
Yeah, I'll definitely concede that point. Because something that I was really interested about is in your answer, you talked about the thing that I absolutely love, which is, well, what's the commercial value? So what's the motivation? Since everyone's motivated by money, or if they're working in academia, they're motivated by money so that then they can get published or expand their lab. And you mentioned also earlier about regulation. So I was wondering, do you think it could be possible for governments to regulate this issue away? As in, you need to actually provide coverage for these languages.
Well, they do, right? Like, I mean, this is covered. These several languages are supported, right? Like, so I mean, Telugu existed in Google Translate like for, I don't know, 15 years, 10 years, at least more than 10 years. But how good is it? Like, we don't have any documentation, at least public-facing documentation, right? Like, we don't know how Google Translate is doing, say, for example, on, say, a language pair. I don't know. I'm just thinking of something, say English to Malayalam or something like that. We don't know that. But then it's like Google Translate has this commercial API, so we really can't know who is using this for what, right? So in theory, some government organization can be using Google Translate to do some translation of their official documents. Although, I don't know, it's probably more likely that they will also have some professional translators who are working together with Google Translate. I don't know how it works.
You would hope.
Yeah, but my point is, like, they have a commercial API. where you pay and get your translations or whatever, but we don't, like, as far as I know, when I use that API, I did not have any information about how good is it. Like on every language pair, say, for example. So if I want to use it, like say for English and Hindi, English and Malayalam, and also English and I don't know what, let us say, I don't know, some very low resource language, they don't perform at the same level, but I have no way to officially get those numbers, right?
Okay. Cool. Well, we've talked a lot about NLP, and we're talking a lot about some of the issues that we currently face with it. And I was wondering, something that I really enjoy, though, is you talking about how people need to take responsibility for the code that they write. And so how do you think we can instill that in people?
That's a tough question, but again, I want to say that everybody does not have to do anything. I would still say better testing and better documentation are the first steps.
Okay.
I mean, we have to know, okay, let us say I write some code for doing some kind of, I don't know, text classification on something, like sentiment classification, let us say. I got, whatever 95% accuracy, and then people declare, we solved sentiment classification. I think the problem lies there. Like before, you solved the problem on that data set, right? Like we don't really know how it works out in the world. So I think when we publish such papers or when we release such software, there should be better documentation saying we tested on this kind of data, and this is what we found out, and these are the kind of tests we did to see how, so I was recently working on a project for named entity recognition. We were testing some named entity recognition system, and we had a data set of from Thailand, like names of people with Thai first names and last names, and we were using a standard named entity recognizer
Sorry, I can see where this is going. Sorry,
yeah,
go ahead.
Yeah, we were using a standard named entity recognizer, and we had this annotated Thai named entity dataset. So like for person names, we just used a standard model, which was doing like 90% or something on state of the art. It's one of the state of the art models, like from one of these standard libraries. I don't want to talk which right now.
That's fine.
I'm sure
we all know the name. It's all good.
Yeah, so we'll write it up at some point soon, but still the point is, like, we just took an off-the-shelf model which was doing very well, which is like state of the art, and tried it with this data set of Thai names, and we didn't do anything. We just used that model, and there was already like we didn't get state of the art performance. Like for names, actually we had over 10% drop just on names, like the precision recall, F-score, and these kind of things for names. And for place names, it was even more. It was, I don't know, close to 20% or something. And this was just with Thai names. Like, God knows what happens if you try with whatever names, like all sorts of geographies and like say male names versus female names, and all sorts of things.
Well, especially too when you start talking about different languages where the transliteration is not standardized.
Yeah,
because I remember I used to live in Korea when I was teaching in Korea, and there was I lived in Korea from 2003 to 2006, and while I was there, they had just introduced a new way to Romanize, to transliterate Korean words into English, and to Romanize them. And it was just so funny because there were you could see three different writing systems, three different ways to Romanize it, and two of them you could kind of work out. One of them was just like, no, it was actually easier just to learn how to read Korean. But I can only imagine if you have a collection of documents that span decades, and they've been Romanized. It's like, yeah, I don't know what's going on here.
Yeah, true.
Yeah. So I'm really curious about what you're saying here, and as far as like sorry, I just had this thought then. That reminds me that the problem isn't the problem isn't the algorithm. The problem's the data.
We can say that, but I don't know. There can be a problem with algorithm as well. That's why I said we need better ways of testing NLP systems the way we do for software engineering systems.
Can you explain more about that?
I'd say, I mean, how do you test an NLP system? We usually do with a standard test set, right?
Mm-hmm.
But then it's language, like people write all sorts of things. So if you're deploying this out there in the real world, what other kinds of tests can you do? Like, I mean, I don't know, some kind of reliability testing, some kind of like, I mean, is this robust for all kinds of inputs? Or like this, I mean, is it sensitive to names from a certain geographical area? Is it sensitive to gender? You know, is it sensitive to the format of the text? Like, what if there are a lot of spelling mistakes in this sentence? Will it be able to do it well? How does it do on other languages? I mean, there are these different dimensions of testing, right? But we don't have a standard taxonomy of testing for NLP. So that's what I'm talking about. Like if I build a new NLP system and I'm ready to deploy it outside, to know about potential pitfalls of it, I need to know what should I test on to know the potential problems. So we don't have that standard as far as I know. That's what I'm trying to say.
Oh, I understand completely. And so then I'm just reminded of what Andrew Ng said about going from a model-centric design to a data-centric design. And because people, they can spend forever and a day tweaking their model and make an incremental increase, but they get a few more observations and it skyrockets. And so what it sounds like to me that you're saying is that we need better training and testing data. And that will, okay. So then basically, one way I can already hear people now saying, so one way to get better training and testing data is to collect more data. And then that gets back to what they were talking about encoded bias, about informed consent, about actually allowing your data to be collected.
Yeah, and also, I mean, okay, more data, but also better quality data as well, right? Like more noisy data may not really give you a good model eventually, whatever complex algorithm you use, right? I mean, a lot of people, there are a lot of companies these days concentrating on this issue, like providing high quality annotated data. And there's a lot of work also on human in the loop modeling and these kind of things, which are all, it's not just about quantity of data in those cases, right? It's also about quality. I mean, it's good to have a large amount of noisy data, but is that really sufficient for us to understand the implications or to understand potential biases is something that we don't know yet, I think. I mean, I think that's not the answer. I think even to understand biases in the data, or even to understand the data, we need better methods than what we have right now.
So what do you think we can do to combat the bias that's baked into the data?
I don't know. I don't think there's a way to combat the bias. I think the first step is to acknowledge that the bias exists. And that's also why I said better documentation is necessary. Like, you know, where is this data coming from? Who collected this data? Like there's a lot of work in the past few years on building these data sheets for data sets, or writing data statements for, I mean, I work in natural language processing, so I can talk more about that. So writing data statements for NLP data sets. So there's been a lot of work in that direction. So creating those kind of documents can help us understand potential sources of bias in a data. Like say, I mean, there are some, I work with some licensed data sets, like in NLP, like there's Linguistics Data Consortium, where people have access to large amount of data sets for NLP stuff. I mean, you need to be members of LDC and all, but even in that, you don't have like when you look at this data, the document, the release notes that come with the data sets, you don't sometimes always get full information on, say, things like who funded this kind of research, or, you know, when you annotated a certain kind of data, how much of a disagreement existed between annotators, how do they resolve this disagreement, what are some examples of poorly annotated, say, sentences in this data. You don't see those kind of things. like say I worked with this data set, a named entity recognition data set sometime back earlier this year onto notes. And when I was randomly looking at some of those sentences, I found some annotation errors, like where what I thought in the context should be identified as a organization was identified as a person. I mean, these kind of things, things that are obvious to us but are annotated wrongly there, but we don't know why. I mean, we just don't know why, because nothing is documented. And who are these annotators? What were their instructions? How did I mean, nothing of that sort was written in those release notes as far as I can find, although a lot of other information is there. But these are the exact things that help us understand potential biases in the data, right? So I think better documentation is one step further than where we are right now, although it doesn't solve the problem completely. And I don't think it's possible to avoid bias in data.
Well, because that gets me back to like the question I always love to ask people is when people say, "Oh my Lord, I'm so shocked there's bias in the algorithms," and I always ask, "Well, who made the algorithm?" And it's like if a person made it, people have biases. They have they have explicit bias, and then they have I'm blanking on the word, unconscious bias. Thank you. They have conscious bias and they have unconscious bias, and people just, if anything designed by people is going to be fallible. So I just keep wondering over and over and over again, like you keep saying, there's no way to avoid it. So what else besides acknowledging it's there and providing as much documentation as possible? Is there anything else we can do to try to combat it?
So the other thing while you were talking, it occurred to me that we don't really have a way to delineate how much of bias is coming because of data itself and how much of bias is coming because of the model, right? So this is also why you sometimes, when you follow these discussions on social media by these researchers, like the data people put the blame on models, whereas the people who typically develop models put the blame on data. But we don't really know like what is causing how much of bias, right? Like, okay, I mean, we can easily think about different ways in which a data is biased, but that data set is biased. But then people also talk a lot about how algorithms themselves are biased because they're created by human beings. But then, like, say, like if we take a facial recognition system, is there a way really for us to say this percentage of the bias is caused because of data and this percentage is because of model? We really don't have that, right? So I think we also need. I mean, that's also something one can do to move further in the direction of reducing bias or coming up with ways to. I don't think we can reduce, but we have to come up with ways to handle it.
I keep coming back to the idea encoded bias, where they audit the data set and they audit the algorithms. And as far as I'm concerned, that's the best step forward. Is actually, as the AI guru, as he used to always say in class, look at your bleeping data. Actually check and see what's in there, because like you did, you find examples where you're like, oh, this is clearly mislabeled. And there's so many of those examples that can be quickly cleaned up. The problem, of course, is when you have a huge data set.
Yeah, we really, I think people who learn NLP generally don't get to learn this kind of like, how do you examine your data? It's very different from, like, say, I mean, you also did some corpus linguistics, I guess, right, when you were at Iowa State. So it's very different from the way they analyze data. Like, I mean, when you're analyzing data to build a machine learning system, maybe you need to look at it in a different way. You need to go beyond, what are the most frequent words or phrases and these kind of things. But we really don't have a clear-cut procedure to do that, right? I mean, I'm talking only about NLP, but it's drastically different if you look at images or speech or something like that. So I think it may come in future. I think it's also like when you're training people to do these kind of things, we need to focus more energies on collection, curation, and exploration of data sets than on building and evaluating models. I mean, it may look uncool for an engineer's mind. I have to build things, not look at these things. But I think, considering that more and more systems are being put up in real world, and we're using a lot of machine learning systems are deciding a lot of things we do in life. I think that's also a part where we need to get better. Like what are some good ways of understanding the data to identify bias?
Well, I think that's a wonderful place to stop. So with that, I would like to thank our guest today, Dr. Sowmya Vajjala. Thank you so very much for your time today. And can you tell everyone one more time, where can they find your book?
Okay, so the website is practicalnlp.ai.
And what's the one thing that, if you could tell everyone who's working in NLP, what's the one thing you highly recommend they would do or they should do?
Learn to look at the data, not at the model first, like if you're starting out. And the other thing I would say is it helps if everyone is a good programmer.
Indeed it does. All right, cool. Well, with that, I'd like to thank our special guest, Dr. Sowmya Vajjala. Thank you so much for your time today. And thank you everyone for tuning in, and look forward to seeing you again on our next Fireside Chat. Later, everyone.
Okay, thank you.